Beirut isn't in the picture. The plan is to create a 40 to 45 kilometer area in which there will be no terrorists.
Israeli forces crossed the border and moved rapidly into Lebanon. But Prime Minister Begin reassured the Israeli parliament.
And if we achieve the 40-kilometer line above our northern border, the job is done. All fighting will stop.
But within hours, Sharon found an excuse for pushing farther.
We got information that units of the 1st Syrian Division were moving south towards the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon.
Sharon persuaded Begin that Israel's troops should now advance deeper into Lebanon to outflank this Syrian force. It would mean going beyond 45 kilometers.
Whoever said we would give terrorists immunity beyond the 45-kilometer line, the government never gave immunity to any terrorist anywhere. We will not give immunity to any terrorist anywhere.
Within 3 days of telling the cabinet that Beirut was not in the picture, Ariel Sharon had moved Israel's troops to the outskirts of the Lebanese capital. For 9 weeks, they laid siege to Beirut, exchanging fire with the Palestinians.
We are here, and we will continue to be here, and we will defend this city, the first, it is very important, it is the first Arab capital which the Israelis are blockading. It is very important. You have to put in consideration what it means for the next generation. What have been done, you will pay its price.
The harder Arafat fought back, the more people in Lebanon suffered. Their capital was being destroyed. Even Lebanese Muslims demanded that Arafat and his fighters leave Beirut.
I was the one who had to raise the question with Arafat. He was shocked. No one had spoken to him like that before. I said, well, we are informing you now.
The Israelis drove the message home by staying close on the heels of the Palestinian leaders.
وأكاد أقول أن إسرائيل الجيش الإسرائيلي
The Israeli army seemed to know what we were going to do before we did.
بتوجهاتنا السياسية. فعندما
If we spoke about fighting on, we were attacked by the Israelis 1 hour later.
نشعر بردود الفعل الإسرائيلية بعد ساعة من الزمن.
There was a meeting in one of our headquarters, and I tell them, please, get out. Leave it. Just now, he said, you are inviting us for a meeting. He said, please, leave this place directly. I don't know why. Believe me, I don't know why. After 15 minutes from our departure, they bombed.
In a cellar under the rubble, the PLO leaders faced a stark choice.
وكان قد وصل إلى قناعة ياسر عرفات.
Arafat was convinced that we had to evacuate Beirut.
ولكنه كان حريصا في نفس الوقت أن لا يسجل.
But he was careful to avoid being the one who ordered Palestinian forces to leave Lebanon.
كان يريد أن يكون القرار جماعيا ويساهم به.
He wanted a collective decision by all the faction leaders.
The price of further defiance was clear.
فكان القرار الصعب.
So we took a hard decision. I can say today that everybody accepted it. All of the leaders of the Palestinian Revolution said yes.
نعم.
In the last days of August 1982, thousands of Palestinian fighters were forced to evacuate Beirut.
Nearly 15,000 men expelled from Beirut. This was unprecedented. An entire terrorist organization expelled from a capital.
Then, in a massive explosion at his party headquarters, Bashir Gemayel, Lebanon's president-elect and Israel's ally, was assassinated. The Israeli defense minister became convinced that Palestinian fighters were still operating in Beirut.
They left behind at least 2,000 armed men. It was clear that once the city was united, it would be necessary to take action against them.
Christian militiamen sought vengeance for the death of Gemayel, while Israeli troops stood by, providing light from flares. The phalangists entered the Palestinian camps of Sabra and Shatila. There were no PLO fighters there. They found only old men, women, and children, and slaughtered them.
You should be ashamed of yourself.
I am not here to explain this horrible tragedy. It belongs to a world of dark motives, not our world. Only those who carried it out can be blamed for this massacre. I hope they will be punished.
You are an enemy of the people. You are worse than evil.
In the largest demonstration in Israel's history, 400,000 people protested Israel's role in the massacre.
It is true that we lost our base in Beirut, but they lost the war.
Once again, through a combined effort of Arabs and Israelis, the PLO had been driven out of an Arab country. Yasser Arafat, the great escaper, was on his way to yet another base, this time in Tunis, 2,000 miles away. The death of President Gamal Abdel Nasser after 18 years in power devastated Egypt and the entire Arab world. His successor, Vice President Anwar Sadat, was considered little more than a figurehead.
Those in Nasser's inner circle thought they could steer policy on the course set by Nasser, and they were confident that Sadat would follow the party line.
The funeral was a grand occasion for the leaders of the Arab states and Nasser's Soviet allies. Nasser had severed relations with America, so the representative from Washington assumed he would be ignored.
Then a soldier came into the room, weaving his way through the crowd. Apparently, it turned out heading for me.
The soldier led Richardson away, out of the sight of the world's press and the watchful eye of the KGB.
I was trained to spot anything that was going on, but it was difficult in that chaos.
We went down the stairs. The lower floor was darkened, and propped up in the hospital bed was the man who had just inherited the presidency of Egypt.
President Sadat was resting away from the crowds after apparently suffering from heat stroke.
He said that he wanted to take advantage of the opportunity to turn a new page in the relationship between our countries.
The next day, Sadat put on a show for the American media. Egypt was a Soviet client state. Sadat considered Israel to be an American one.
The United States provide Israel from the loaf of bread to the phantom to the even deficit in the budget itself. So it is the vein of life. Vein of life for Israel goes from the United States.
Sadat didn't want to negotiate with Israel himself. He wanted the Americans to intervene, to deliver to Egypt the territories lost in 1967. In the 3 years since the war, Israel had established a formidable defense line along the Suez Canal, 70 miles from Cairo.
What are you doing?
I'm getting ready to blast you Israelis.
Why?
Because you Israelis occupy our land.
The Suez Canal had been closed since 1967. Sadat now told the Americans that if Israel moved back a few miles from the canal, he would reopen it, even to ships trading with Israel. Sadat's proposal followed statements made by Moshe Dayan, Israel's defense minister. Dayan said that the Sinai should eventually be returned to Egypt.
What we say is that we sit there just because the war is going on. But once you agree to make peace agreement, we don't think that we should sit on your Suez Canal.
Golda Meir didn't want to negotiate through the Americans. She wanted direct talks with Sadat.
I'm prepared to go to Cairo, I'm prepared to go to Damascus, I'm prepared to go to Amman, I'm prepared to go to Beirut. Anywhere.
You would go to these places?
Yes, happily. To negotiate peace, of course.
In Washington, President Nixon looked for the right person to urge Sadat's proposal on Golda Meir. He chose Joe Sisko.
I can recall the words to this day. He said, "Joe, press Golda. Press her hard, but don't cause a major Donnybrook between Israel and the United States."
Sisko met with the entire Israeli cabinet, but only Golda Meir negotiated.
Golda Meir took it upon herself to do all of the talking. It was interesting to see everyone here, all the ministers, nobody opening their mouth.
What they did to release their tension was sending little notes to each other.
I sent Dayan a chat saying, "Listen, Moshe, I think we can get you some support." He sent back a very abrupt reply saying sarcastically, "Thank you very much. But if Golda is not for this, then I'm not for it either."
Sisko saw that something was happening, that nobody was supposed to speak there, and so he was a very smart negotiator. He asked the Prime Minister whether he is permitted to ask the Minister of Defense one question, a professional question. So what could she say?
I said to him, "Mr. Minister, if we don't do anything, what do you think is going to happen?"
Dayan said, "Well, I cannot imagine that any government will tolerate indefinitely a situation where a strong army is poised at the gates of its capital." He was exaggerating. After all, our forces were at a distance of more than 100 kilometers from Cairo, and this will lead to war.
Golda Meir still insisted on direct talks.
The next day, I walked up with these flowers, rather gingerly, and she said to me, "Oh, Joe, now you're saying it with flowers. It won't do you any good."
In Cairo, Israel's rebuff almost brought about the downfall of the man who had proposed the initiative, Anwar Sadat. So he reversed course and tried a tactic more likely to win Arab support.
War is now inevitable. Whatever the price, whatever the sacrifice, we will not back down. We will not give up 1 centimeter of Arab land.
I thought of Sadat as a character out of Aida. I didn't take him seriously. He kept making grandiloquent pronouncements. He never acted on them. So I, frankly, thought he was bluffing. Kissinger was too preoccupied with the Vietnam War to give the Middle East much attention. Even when Sadat made another offer. He wanted Israel to return to the 67 borders, in return for which Egypt would be willing to make peace, which was a big step because no Arab state had as yet ever flatly said that they would make peace. We were in no position to handle that.
Sadat told me that Kissinger had said, if all you have is a problem, I cannot deal with it. But if it becomes a crisis, then I can intervene.
Disappointed with American diplomacy, yet still unwilling to talk to Israel directly, Sadat set out to prepare for war.
The High Command met at Sadat's house in Giza. Sadat told us, there is no hope of a peaceful solution, and I will not surrender to Israel. So our only option is war.
He said, get me back just 10 centimeters of the Sinai, and I will negotiate a miracle.
Sadat then proposed a secret alliance with President Assad of Syria. They agreed to plan a joint attack on Israel. Syria's top generals sailed to Alexandria to meet their Egyptian counterparts.
I went on a Russian ship, dressed in civilian clothes. I had a fake Egyptian passport and was using an alias, Jamal Hassan.
Once they arrived, they kept up the subterfuge.
In the evenings, we went to a nightclub, the Mumtaza. We were drinking and having fun. We wanted people to think we were just enjoying ourselves and that we did not have a care in the world.
At the hotel, the generals discussed the plans for their joint attack and decided on a special date.
The 6th of October was Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. For the Jews, it is a holy day, a day of rest.
The Syrians hoped at least to recapture the Golan Heights, taken from them in 1967. To keep Israel's troops tied down, they needed Egyptian forces to advance across the Sinai. But the Egyptians had their own plan. They intended to limit their advance to territory protected by their anti-aircraft missiles in Egypt.
Our missiles could protect us for up to 12 kilometers. That would compensate for the inferiority of our Air Force.
Egypt's chief of staff urged Sadat to stick to their own plan.
He said, okay, we'll draw up a plan to show to the Syrians. This second plan had us advancing to the Sinai passes, but it was done just for the Syrians.
So it was agreed that the Egyptians would advance to the passes. They would pause to reorganize and then go forward again. Meanwhile, we would occupy the Golan Heights.
Whatever plans the Egyptians adopted, first they would have to cross the Suez Canal and do it under the gaze of Israeli troops.
The enemy are just 200 meters away. I can see them, they can see me. How can I catch them by surprise?
طب افاجئهم ازاي؟
I must hide my intentions.
افاجئهم في النية اخفيها.
كنا بنقوم بأعمال
We carried out many military exercises. The aim was to deceive Israeli intelligence. We wanted them to think we were expecting an attack from Israel.
Now, the presidents of Egypt and Syria also set out to deceive their fellow Arab, Jordan's King Hussein. They claimed Israel was about to attack them.
Sadat and Assad were worried about an attack on Syria that could have one of its hooks come through northern Jordan. In the final analysis, I assured them that as far as we were concerned, no one is going to use our country to attack anyone.
King Hussein smelled a rat. The last time Egypt and Syria had maneuvered him into a war with Israel, he had ended up losing a large slice of his kingdom. So he flew off alone, telling no one he was going to meet Golda Meir.
I was very concerned and worried that a state of no peace and no war was going to end us up in serious difficulty.
King Hussein talked about only one thing. He warned us to expect an attack from Syria and Egypt.
The Prime Minister received the king alone, but the head of Israeli military intelligence was listening, as Hussein warned of the Syrian-Egyptian preparations for war.
She was not convinced this information was reliable. You see, King Hussein himself was not 100% sure.
Instead of mobilizing the Israeli reserves, Golda Meir kept in place the usual 450 troops along the canal.
The attack was due on Saturday, October 6th. On the Friday, I went down and looked across the canal. On the other side, nothing was moving. I went back and told Sadat, they can find out now. I don't care.
It was not till dawn the next day, as most Jews were preparing to go to synagogue for Yom Kippur, that Israeli intelligence finally became convinced that Egypt and Syria would attack within hours. The Israelis heard the call to arms on the radio and from rabbis in their synagogues. At 2 p.m., as civilians were reporting for duty, Egypt opened fire.
Our troops crossed the canal. They were shouting, "God is great, God is great," and they planted the Egyptian flag on the Sinai itself.
About 6 o'clock, I told my people, my forces, felicitations. The Israelis has lost their balance.
Sadat's armies drove the Israelis from the Suez Canal. Israel's Air Force tried to retaliate, but failed to break through Egypt's missile cover. The Egyptians advanced 8 miles into the Sinai, and then stopped, as planned. In the north, Syria's attack also caught Israel off balance. 600 Syrian tanks rolled over Israel's defenses and across the Golan Heights.
weren't ready today. We came from the home, in the middle of Yom Kippur.
So who was here? That was regular soldiers?
Yes, only the regular.
So they must have had a hard time?
Oh yeah, very hard.
Did you have many casualties?
Well, with such things we don't know. It's not allowed to talk about them.
The Syrians were expected to press their advantage.
We must keep on fighting with all our courage, faith, and trust, as a nation that knows we're fighting for our lives. And we are fighting for our lives.
Israel's defeat appeared imminent, but on the fourth day, the Syrians ran into a large Israeli force. Israel had been able to divert troops to the Syrian front because the Egyptian army had halted. Syria's President Assad demanded to know why the Egyptians were not advancing through the Sinai as agreed.
The president kept phoning Sadat and insisting, "This is not what we agreed." Sadat never gave him a straight answer.
Syria appealed over Sadat's head to the Soviet Union, still Egypt's patron. The Soviet Prime Minister came to Cairo to sort things out.
Prime Minister Kosygin kept asking Sadat why his forces had stopped without taking the Sinai. He was infuriated by Sadat's answers.
Полностью не удовлетворен разговорами с Садатом.
President Sadat yielded to Soviet pressure and gave the order to advance, much to the dismay of his chief of staff.
It was doomed to failure from the start. Israel's air force was much stronger than ours.
Now the war began to swing Israel's way. In 3 hours, 250 Egyptian tanks were destroyed. But Egypt still had 2 armies in the Sinai. The Israelis planned a daring coup. They set out to cut through the gap in the Egyptian lines, create a bridgehead over the canal, and sweep around to isolate the Egyptian Third Army. The architect of the plan was General Ariel Sharon.
We slipped through the Egyptian lines without major problems. But when we reached the canal, there was a ferocious battle. Eventually, at 1 in the morning, the paratroopers crossed to the other side in dinghies.
The next day, Israeli forces raced across the canal to secure their bridgehead.
I was at the canal. I could see the tanks crossing and the trees on the other side. It was a great feeling.
Israel's troops were now only hours from Cairo. President Sadat begged the Soviets to arrange a ceasefire.
The Israelis crossed the canal, and about 24 hours later, we got a message from Brezhnev inviting me to come to Moscow.
We thought Kissinger's visit to Moscow would be useful. He could help us stop the conflict.
We thought it would give the Israelis more time if I went to Moscow, because nothing could happen until I got there. While I was in the air, Nixon sent a message directly to Brezhnev saying that I was fully authorized to conclude, but I frankly wanted to stall.
The Soviets were in such a hurry to end the fighting that General Secretary Brezhnev led the talks with Kissinger himself.
He insisted that the advance be stopped. In return, Kissinger wanted the Arabs to recognize Israel's right to exist.
What we said was that there should be direct negotiations at some point between the Arabs and Israel. I told Brezhnev I would carefully communicate everything he said to Washington, but that there had to be some time interval so that I could get the president's views. And he said, no, here's a message. And he gave me power of attorney, that, in effect, power of attorney that the president had given me, which did not thrill me.
The Secretary of State realized he could stall no longer. While still in Moscow, he agreed to terms for a ceasefire. But it was another 5 days before the war ended. During that time, the Israelis encircled the Egyptian Third Army. A day later, the opposing generals met in the desert to work out how to disentangle their forces. It was the first formal meeting of Egyptian and Israeli officers in 25 years.
He offered me coffee. I said, no, thank you. He asked, can I get you anything else? I said, no. He said, it's cold. Can I get you a coat? I said, no, thank you. That was the end of the first meeting.
It was a week before the Egyptian general began to relax.
We went out and sat on the sand. We put a map down in front of us, and we put stones on it. We started to talk about how to disengage our forces. I said, look, we have to end the friction between our forces. The answer is, you go back to the west side of the canal, and we will pull back to the east side. I went and told Sadat we had reached an agreement. He was pleased with what we had achieved.
Each side's dead were returned, and Israel allowed supplies through to the trapped Egyptians. But Sadat wanted more than a ceasefire and a disengagement. He wanted the Sinai back. But once again, he would talk only to the Americans.
He came out in military uniforms and said, I need a Kissinger plan. I agreed to do a shuttle and settle it fast, and he said he would make major concessions to make it possible.
Kissinger decided the way forward was to bring all the parties to a peace conference in Geneva.
I never thought you would kiss a woman.
After all, it's kissing her. I wonder who's kissing her now.
The Egyptians and Israelis agreed to attend the conference. And then there was President Assad of Syria.
I had heard he was impossible, but he greeted me with extraordinary politeness and courtesy. And I said, you know, it's amazing. They all accuse you of being so difficult.
Whenever Kissinger wanted to change the date or venue, President Assad agreed. Kissinger told him, you are so accommodating.
I got overconfident, and I said, is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't? He said, yes, you didn't ask me whether I'm going to the conference. I said, are you? He said, no.
Assad did not want to negotiate with Israel. But Kissinger was able to get the rival armies to disengage. Sadat then attempted to strengthen his hand by embracing Syrian and Palestinian objectives.
Israel must move on all the fronts, on the Egyptian front, the Syrian front, the Jordanian front, the Palestinian front.
At a time when Arafat wanted to replace Israel with a Palestinian state, Sadat pledged unity.
You see, we are cooperating together. And as we have mentioned, there are three partners: Egyptians, Syrians, and the Palestinians.
2 restless years passed. Then, Israeli elections brought forth a leader determined to hold on to the West Bank and Gaza.
What occupied territories? If you mean Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza Strip, they are liberated territories. They are an integral part of the land of Israel.
The new prime minister made the building of settlements his first priority. Settlements like the new town of Yamit, where 5,000 Jews lived in the Sinai. Begin was highly suspicious of Sadat.
Sadat is an implacable enemy of Israel. This is also the truth. He is no fool, but he is an enemy.
Sadat's response would write his name indelibly into the history books. He announced he would make a keynote speech to the Egyptian parliament. He invited the leader of the PLO to attend.
Arafat was happy to be in the parliament, and he was happy that Sadat is paying attention to the Palestinian problem.
السادات بعدين ابتعد عن الورق المكتوب وابتدى يتكلم من دماغه.
Sadat put his text aside, but he carried on speaking. I told the foreign minister he is about to throw a political grenade.
After 7 years of trying everything else but talking to Israel, Sadat broke the ultimate Arab taboo.
I am willing to go anywhere. Israel will be surprised to hear that I am ready to go to them, even to the Knesset itself, and negotiate with them.
The idea that Sadat would negotiate directly with Israel was so unthinkable, the audience applauded without realizing what he had said.
Everyone was applauding Sadat. Even Yasser Arafat was clapping. I know, because he was sitting next to me.
In Tel Aviv, no one was sure if Sadat really meant it.
Sadat then said if Begin invited him, he would come next week.
The next day, Prime Minister Begin was hosting a lunch at the Hilton Hotel.
The head of CBS in Israel wanted Begin's reaction. Begin was eating at the head table. I went up and gave him the message. He said, sure, I'll invite Sadat from here.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hereby invite President Sadat on behalf of the government of Israel to come to Jerusalem and to start negotiations to establish permanent peace between Israel and Egypt.
Before accepting the invitation, Sadat flew to Syria to persuade President Assad that the trip to Jerusalem would not be a betrayal of the Arab cause.
We asked the president to arrest Sadat to stop him going anywhere.
But Assad considered Sadat his guest and preferred to hear him out.
President Assad was trying to make Sadat change his mind.
He told me, it will be proved that you are wrong. I said, very well, Assad. This is a sacred mission for me. And if this is going to be the last mission as a president, I shall be very happy to fulfill it.
President Assad was not impressed. They talked for 7 hours.
Assad's ministers urged him to act. The Presidential Guard was standing by.
President Assad refused. He said, "It is against the Arab tradition for a man to arrest his guest."
President Sadat returned safely to Egypt. 3 days later, he set off for Jerusalem.
I feared for his safety. We had been enemies for 40 years. He was putting himself at their mercy. He would be sleeping there that night. I was very anxious. Sadat's plane was late. I overheard a senior security officer talking. He was saying, "Hold on. Maybe instead of Sadat, there is a suicide squad on the plane. And they will jump out and kill the assembled Israeli leaders."
When we arrived in Tel Aviv, it was like I was coming to outer space. It means it was something completely new. I find myself in a car, sitting near Moshe Dayan, and we have to find how to begin a conversation. And I have read in the book that he was interested in archaeology. So I mentioned that I was interested in archaeology, and we begin to talk archaeology.
The Israeli people greeted Sadat's arrival from Egypt as though he were Moses, come again.
I come to you today with a firm desire to make peace.
Sadat offered peace, but he was careful not to abandon the other Arab states or the Palestinians.
There are Arab lands still under Israeli occupation. We insist on complete withdrawal from these territories, including Arab Jerusalem. It was quite a speech, quite disturbing. I passed a note to Begin saying we must be on our guard.
Ezra Weizmann, the defense minister, who was a great advocate for peace, said when he heard the speech that maybe we should mobilize the reserves.
The visitors went from the Knesset to a dinner in their honor.